In May 1962, at an ANZUS meeting in Canberra, United States Secretary of State Dean Rusk made an admission that would echo through military circles for decades. The U.S. Armed Forces knew little about jungle warfare, he said quietly to assembled Australian and New Zealand officials. This wasn't false modesty. It wasn't diplomatic courtesy. It was fear spoken candidly by a man who understood that America was about to commit hundreds of thousands of soldiers to a war they weren't prepared to fight. His testimony revealed something the official records would later confirm. The most powerful military on Earth, with overwhelming firepower and technological superiority, lacked the tactical knowledge to fight effectively in the jungle, and they were turning to a much smaller ally, one that had mastered what they could not. To understand why American forces sought out Australian expertise, you need to understand where that expertise came from and what made it so different from everything the United States military had developed. The story begins not in Vietnam, but in the dense tropical forests of Malaya and Borneo, where Australian soldiers learned lessons that would prove invaluable in a war that hadn't yet started. When the Malayan emergency erupted in June 1948, the British Commonwealth found itself facing a guerrilla insurgency that would last 12 years. The Malayan Communist Party and its military wing, the Malayan Races Liberation Army, launched a campaign of assassination, sabotage, and jungle warfare against colonial forces. The British quickly discovered that conventional military tactics developed for European battlefields were almost useless in the dense Malaysian jungle. Roads became kill zones, large formations became targets, traditional command structures broke down in terrain where visual contact rarely extended beyond a few dozen meters. Australia answered Britain's call for assistance in 1950, initially sending Royal Australian Air Force Dakota Transport aircraft and Lincoln bombers. But the real transformation came when Australian ground forces arrived. The 2nd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, deployed in 1955, followed by rotations of the 3rd and 1st Battalions. These weren't raw recruits learning on the job. Many were veterans who'd served in World War II, men who'd fought the Japanese in the jungles of New Guinea and understood the fundamental truth about jungle warfare that would take Americans years to learn. In the jungle, the small unit is king. Australian forces in Malaya developed a counterinsurgency approach that emphasized patience over firepower, intelligence over aggression, and individual soldier skill over overwhelming force. They conducted extensive patrolling, sometimes covering only 1,000 to 1,500 yards in a full day's march through terrain so dense that visibility extended mere feet. They learned to move silently, to read the jungle's subtle signs, to distinguish between normal forest sounds and the telltale indicators of human presence. They mastered the art of the ambush, learning to remain motionless for hours in positions that gave them advantage. They built relationships with local populations, understanding that winning hearts and minds was as important as winning firefights. The lessons learned in Malaya were further refined during the Indonesian confrontation from 1963 to 1966, when Australian forces, including the newly expanded Special Air Service Regiment, conducted operations in Borneo. Here they perfected small unit tactics, long-range reconnaissance patrols, and cross-border operations into Indonesian territory. They learned to live in the jungle for weeks at a time, carrying everything they needed on their backs, moving like ghosts through terrain that seemed impenetrable. They learned that success in jungle warfare wasn't about technology or firepower. It was about patience, discipline, fieldcraft, and an almost mystical ability to become part of the environment you were operating in. By the time American forces began their buildup in Vietnam in 1965, Australian forces had accumulated nearly 2 decades of continuous jungle warfare experience. They understood something fundamental that the American military, trained and equipped for mechanized warfare on European plains, had never fully grasped. In the jungle, everything changes. The tactics that worked in open terrain became liabilities. The firepower that dominated conventional battlefields became difficult to employ effectively. The technological advantages that gave Western militaries their edge often became burdens in an environment where a silent step mattered more than an artillery battery. The American approach to Vietnam reflected their Cold War doctrine, developed primarily for fighting the Soviet Union on European battlefields. It emphasized overwhelming firepower, rapid mobility through mechanized forces, and the ability to call in massive air and artillery support at a moment's notice. American infantry operated in company and battalion-strength formations. When they made contact with the enemy, their doctrine called for fixing the enemy in place and then destroying them with coordinated fires from artillery, helicopter gunships, and close air support. It was a doctrine that had worked in Korea, that made sense on paper, and that would prove deeply problematic in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The problems manifested immediately. American units moved through the jungle like they moved everywhere else, in large formations with equipment that clanked and rattled, with radios that crackled, with voices that carried. They followed trails because moving through dense vegetation was exhausting and time-consuming. They established fire support bases on hilltops because that's what doctrine dictated. They conducted search and destroy operations because that's what they'd trained for. And the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army learned their patterns, learned their timings, learned exactly how to fight them and when to avoid them. Vietnamese fighters developed tactics specifically designed to exploit American operational methods. They'd engage American patrols briefly, just long enough to inflict casualties and make contact. Then they'd break contact and fade into the jungle before the inevitable American response arrived. They knew that American forces would immediately call for artillery, helicopter gunships, and airstrikes. So they fought close, a tactic they called hugging, staying so near to American positions that supporting fires couldn't be employed without hitting friendly forces. And when they heard the distinctive sound of approaching helicopters, they simply melted into the forest. By the time American firepower arrived, the target was gone. The jungle was empty. The operation was over. American commanders recognized the problem. They understood that their conventional approach wasn't working as effectively as it should. They'd achieved tactical victories but couldn't translate them into strategic success. The enemy remained elusive, capable of choosing when and where to fight, able to disappear whenever superior American firepower came to bear. Intelligence was often poor. Reconnaissance was difficult. Large American formations moved slowly through terrain that favored the defender. Something needed to change. That's when American military leadership looked to their Australian allies, who were operating in Puoc Tuy province with remarkable effectiveness. The Australians had established the first Australian task force at Nui Dat in April 1966, and they'd brought with them a completely different approach to jungle warfare. While American battalions swept through contested areas in company and battalion strength formations, Australian forces conducted constant small unit patrolling. While American doctrine emphasized firepower and rapid reaction, Australian doctrine emphasized patience and fieldcraft, while American forces often moved noisily through the jungle, announcing their presence to anyone within hearing distance. Australian patrols moved in near silence, sometimes covering less than a kilometer in an entire day. The contrast was stark enough that journalist Gerald Stone described it in 1966. The Australian battalion has been described as the safest combat force in Vietnam. It is widely felt that the Australians have shown themselves able to give chase to the guerrillas without exposing themselves to the lethal ambushes that have claimed so many American dead. Australian patrols shun jungle tracks and clearings, picking their way carefully and quietly through bamboo thickets and tangled foliage. It is a frustrating experience to trek through the jungle with Australians. Patrols have taken as much as 9 hours to sweep a mile of terrain. They move forward a few steps at a time, stop, listen, then proceed again. This methodical approach wasn't slow because Australians were cautious. It was deliberate because they understood jungle warfare at a fundamental level that American doctrine hadn't yet incorporated. Every step was calculated. Every sound was evaluated. Every piece of terrain was analyzed for tactical advantage before moving through it. Australian soldiers wrapped metal equipment in tape to eliminate noise. They mixed mud into their uniforms to eliminate shine. They moved in small sections and half-platoon formations rather than large companies. They patrolled constantly, establishing a presence throughout their area of operations rather than conducting large sweeps that announced their movements days in advance. But it was the Australian Special Air Service Regiment that truly exemplified the mastery of jungle warfare that American forces wanted to learn. The SASR had deployed to Vietnam in 1966, operating from a position that became known as SAS Hill at Nui Dat. They conducted long-range reconnaissance patrols that penetrated deep into enemy-held territory, gathering intelligence and conducting offensive operations with a level of effectiveness that bordered on legendary. SASR patrols operated in 4 to 6 man teams, a size that American reconnaissance doctrine initially considered too small for effective operations. But the Australians understood that in the jungle small teams had advantages that larger formations couldn't match. They were quieter. They were harder to detect. They could hide more easily. They could move through terrain that larger groups couldn't navigate. And when they made contact, they employed tactics specifically designed to make the enemy think they were facing a much larger force. The tactics were simple but extraordinarily effective. SASR patrols moved slowly, sometimes covering less than a kilometer in a full day of patrolling. They'd stop every few hundred meters and sit absolutely still for 20 or 30 minutes, just watching and listening. They studied the jungle around them, looking for signs of recent human activity, bent vegetation, footprints, disturbed soil, smoke, cooking smells, anything that indicated enemy presence. They inserted by helicopter, but then disappeared so completely that even friendly forces often couldn't locate them. They operated in radio silence, unless they had intelligence to report or needed extraction. They lived in the jungle for weeks at a time, sleeping in the open without fires, eating cold rations, moving like shadows through terrain that seemed impenetrable. When they ambushed enemy forces, they did so with devastating effectiveness. They'd select ambush positions days in advance, watching trails and learning enemy patterns. When the moment came, they'd unleash a volume of fire from automatic weapons and M79 grenade launchers that made the enemy think they were facing a platoon or even a company rather than 5 men. The engagement would last maybe 60 seconds, sometimes less. Then the patrol would withdraw, using pre-planned extraction routes, often before enemy reinforcements could even determine where the fire had come from. The psychological impact was profound. Vietnamese forces could prepare for American operations. They could learn American patterns, predict American movements, and develop tactics to counter American firepower. But they couldn't prepare for an enemy they couldn't detect. SASR operations created a climate of perpetual uncertainty in areas where they operated. Every trail became potentially dangerous. Every jungle clearing could conceal watchers. Every movement risked walking into an ambush that had been set up days in advance. The Vietnamese called them Ma Rung, the phantoms of the jungle, and the name wasn't meant as a compliment. It was fear given form. The operational results spoke for themselves. Between 1966 and 1971, the 3 SASR squadrons that rotated through Vietnam conducted nearly 1,200 patrols. They eliminated over 600 enemy soldiers confirmed, and the estimates for casualties they inflicted were certainly higher. And their own losses? 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidental deaths, 1 missing, and 28 wounded. That kill ratio was unprecedented in the entire war. No other unit, American or Allied, achieved anything close to those numbers. American military leadership noticed. In September 1966, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam established the May CV Recondo School at Nha Trang, and they turned to the Australians for help. The school's mission was to train long-range reconnaissance patrol personnel from all free world military assistance forces in the techniques and tactics needed for effective jungle reconnaissance. And who better to teach those techniques than the soldiers who'd mastered them through years of experience in Malaya, Borneo, and now Vietnam? Australian SAS personnel became instructors at the Recondo School, passing on the hard-won lessons of jungle warfare to American students. The course was 3 weeks long, encompassing 260 hours of classroom and field instruction. It covered patrolling techniques, navigation, radio procedures, weapons familiarization with both Allied and enemy weapons, rappelling, ambush techniques, escape and evasion, and culminated in an actual combat patrol in the jungle between Nha Trang and Cam Ranh Bay. The Recondo School's curriculum reflected Australian tactical philosophy. Students learned to move slowly and quietly, to observe before acting, to use terrain for concealment and advantage. They learned that in the jungle patience wasn't a luxury, but a survival skill. They learned to distinguish between different types of jungle sounds, to recognize signs of enemy presence, to navigate by terrain features when traditional navigation methods failed. They learned to think in terms of small team tactics, where every member of the patrol had to be self-sufficient and capable of independent action. The standards were rigorous. The school had a 50% failure rate. Over the course of its operation from 1966 to 1970, more than 5,300 men attempted the course. Only 3,300 graduated. Several students died during the final combat patrol exercise, and many others were wounded. It earned a nickname among troops, the deadliest school on earth. But those who graduated carried their Recondo number with pride and brought back to their units knowledge that transformed American long-range reconnaissance patrol operations. Beyond the formal instruction at Recondo School, Australian SAS personnel worked directly with American Special Operations Forces in the field. They operated alongside U.S. Army Special Forces and Navy SEALs, sharing tactics and techniques through direct operational experience. They provided instructors to the Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol Training Wing at the Von Keep Training Center, which was operated by the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam. This hands-on knowledge transfer was perhaps even more valuable than formal instruction because it demonstrated Australian tactics in real operational conditions. American soldiers who worked with Australian SAS came away impressed and often humbled. The Australians did things that seemed almost impossible. They moved through jungle so dense that American units struggled to travel a few hundred meters a day, and they did it silently, leaving almost no trace. They set up observation positions within sight of enemy base camps and remained undetected for days. They conducted ambushes so precise and devastating that enemy forces often couldn't even determine what had hit them. They extracted from hot landing zones under fire with a discipline and coordination that seemed almost choreographed. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, which had been in country since 1962, had been teaching jungle warfare techniques to South Vietnamese forces and working alongside American advisors from the beginning. These advisors were hand-picked experts, many with extensive experience from the Malayan emergency. They were older than typical combat soldiers, with an average age of 35. They understood counterinsurgency warfare, they understood jungle operations, and they understood that winning this type of war required more than firepower. But there was resistance to adopting Australian methods, particularly early in the war. American military culture emphasized different values: speed over patience, firepower over stealth, technological superiority over individual fieldcraft. American logistics supported a style of warfare that Australian forces couldn't sustain. American soldiers had access to daily resupply by helicopter, hot meals, clean water, regular extraction to rear areas. Australian patrols carried everything they needed for weeks of operations. American doctrine emphasized the platoon and company as the basic tactical unit. Australian doctrine emphasized the section and patrol. These weren't just tactical differences. They reflected fundamentally different philosophies about how to fight in the jungle. Some American commanders saw Australian methods as too slow, too cautious, too small-scale. They wanted results measured in body count and territory controlled. They had the firepower and technology to dominate the battlefield through conventional means. Why adopt tactics that seemed to diminish those advantages? But other American commanders, particularly those in special operations and reconnaissance units, understood that Australian methods worked precisely because they were designed specifically for jungle warfare rather than adapted from conventional doctrine. The debate became clearer as the war progressed. American forces could win battles, they could clear villages, they could dominate terrain wherever they concentrated their forces, but the enemy remained elusive, able to choose when and where to fight, capable of inflicting steady casualties through ambushes and mines, impossible to decisively defeat through conventional operations. The strategic problem wasn't firepower or technology. It was the ability to find and fix an enemy who refused to fight on American terms, and that required the kind of tactical patience and jungle fieldcraft that Australian forces had mastered. Long-range reconnaissance patrols became increasingly important to American operations as commanders recognized the intelligence gap. American forces needed to know where the enemy was, where they were moving, what their intentions were. Standard intelligence methods weren't providing that information with sufficient accuracy or timeliness. Reconnaissance patrols that could penetrate deep into enemy territory and observe without being detected became critical to operational planning. And those patrols needed to operate using tactics that kept them alive in an environment where the enemy had every advantage. American LRRP units began adopting Australian methods. They reduced patrol sizes. They slowed down their movement. They emphasized silent movement and careful observation. They trained in camouflage and concealment specific to jungle operations. They learned to read terrain and vegetation to identify likely enemy positions and movement routes. They studied enemy tactics and patterns. They practiced breaking contact and extraction procedures until they became second nature, and their effectiveness improved dramatically. The transformation wasn't universal or immediate. Large unit operations continued to dominate American strategy throughout much of the war. Search and destroy missions, free-fire zones, massive artillery, and air support remained central to how American forces fought. The organizational culture of the U.S. military, with its emphasis on rapid rotation of personnel and standardized training, made it difficult to build and maintain the institutional knowledge that jungle warfare required. Australian units built expertise over years of deployment and training. American units built it piecemeal, with individual soldiers and small units learning hard lessons that often weren't effectively transferred when they rotated home. But in the reconnaissance and special operations community, Australian influence was profound and lasting. The tactics and techniques taught by Australian instructors at Recondo School and demonstrated by SASR patrols in the field became the foundation for American long-range patrol doctrine. The emphasis on small team operations, on patience and observation, on silent movement and careful camouflage, on detailed planning and rehearsal, all of these reflected lessons learned from Australian experience and expertise. The difference in results was measurable. Units that adopted Australian-style tactics achieved better intelligence collection, suffered fewer casualties, and had more successful engagements with enemy forces. They learned to see the jungle not as an obstacle but as an environment that could be understood and used to advantage. They learned that in jungle warfare, the force that moves most slowly and quietly often has the advantage over the force that moves quickly and noisily, regardless of its size or firepower. They learned that patience, fieldcraft, and tactical discipline mattered more than technology or numbers. This wasn't just about tactics. It was about a fundamental difference in how Australians and Americans approached warfare in the jungle environment. American military culture valued initiative, aggressiveness, and decisive action. These were valuable attributes in many combat situations, but in the jungle they could be liabilities. The patrol that moved too quickly missed signs of enemy presence. The unit that was too aggressive walked into prepared ambushes. The force that sought decisive action gave away its position and intentions. Australian military culture, shaped by years of jungle operations, valued different attributes: patience, careful observation, tactical discipline, the ability to remain motionless and silent for hours. These weren't passive qualities. They required extraordinary discipline and mental toughness, but they were essential for effective jungle operations, and they were qualities that couldn't be taught in a few weeks of training. They had to be cultivated through extensive experience and maintained through rigorous standards. The Australian approach to training reinforced these qualities. Before deploying to Vietnam, Australian soldiers underwent intensive jungle warfare training at the Jungle Training Centre at Canungra in Queensland. The training was realistic, demanding, and specifically focused on the skills needed for jungle operations. Soldiers learned to navigate by terrain features, to recognize jungle plants and their uses, to move silently through dense vegetation, to construct field-expedient shelters and equipment, to purify water, to treat jungle-specific medical conditions. The training created a foundation of knowledge that was then built upon through operational experience. American training, by contrast, was more generalized. Basic training prepared soldiers for a wide range of possible combat environments. Infantry training built on that foundation with tactics and skills applicable to conventional warfare. Jungle-specific training, when it occurred, was often compressed into a few weeks before deployment. The result was that American soldiers arrived in Vietnam with less specific preparation for the environment they'd be fighting in. They learned on the job, and the learning curve was often paid for with casualties. The institutional difference extended to leadership development. Australian NCOs and junior officers typically had more experience and training before assuming leadership positions. Many had served in Malaya or Borneo before Vietnam. They understood jungle operations from experience, not just from training manuals. They could teach soldiers by demonstration, not just instruction. American junior leaders were often younger and less experienced, learning to lead while simultaneously learning to fight in an unfamiliar environment. Some adapted brilliantly, others struggled. The variability in leadership quality affected unit effectiveness significantly. The Australian emphasis on constant patrolling created another advantage: intimate knowledge of the area of operations. Australian forces in Phuoc Tuy Province patrolled constantly, in all weather, day and night. Over time, they developed an understanding of the terrain, the vegetation, the local population, and enemy patterns of activity that gave them a significant intelligence advantage. They knew which trails the enemy used, which areas were likely ambush sites, which villages were sympathetic to the Viet Cong, which times of day enemy movements were most common. This knowledge couldn't be gained through aerial reconnaissance or intelligence reports. It required boots on the ground, day after day, week after week. American forces conducted patrols, but the scale and frequency varied significantly by unit and time period. Large operations like search and destroy missions received more emphasis than sustained, methodical patrolling. Fire support bases became hubs of activity, with security patrols conducted in the immediate vicinity, but less emphasis on constant small unit operations throughout the entire area. The result was that American forces often had less detailed knowledge of their operating areas than Australian forces achieved through constant patrolling. This difference manifested in operational results. Australian forces in Phuoc Tuy Province gradually established control over most of the province. By 1971, Highway 15, the main route running through Phuoc Tuy between Saigon and Vung Tau, was open to unescorted traffic. Local Viet Cong forces had been largely cleared out and were increasingly dependent on reinforcements from North Vietnam. The Iao province had been, for practical purposes, pacified through a combination of military operations, civil affairs, and constant patrolling that denied the enemy freedom of movement. This success didn't come from overwhelming firepower or advanced technology. It came from methodical application of counterinsurgency principles that Australian forces had developed in Malaya and refined in Borneo and Vietnam. It demonstrated that jungle warfare and counterinsurgency required a different approach than conventional warfare. The lessons were there for American forces to learn, and many did learn them, particularly in reconnaissance and special operations units. The influence of Australian tactics extended beyond the war itself. American special operations doctrine was fundamentally reshaped by the Vietnam experience, and Australian influence was a significant part of that reshopping. The emphasis on small team operations, on extensive pre-mission planning and rehearsal, on stealth and fieldcraft over firepower, on patience and tactical discipline, all of these became central to American Special Operations methodology. The Rangers, the Special Forces, the emerging Special Missions units all incorporated lessons that had been taught by Australian instructors and demonstrated by Australian operational successes. Yet, despite this influence, there remained fundamental differences in how American and Australian forces approached jungle warfare. American doctrine never fully embraced the slow, methodical patrolling that was central to Australian operations. American culture and logistics supported a different operational tempo. American forces could call on firepower that Australian forces couldn't match. American helicopter mobility enabled rapid insertion and extraction that changed the tactical calculus. These weren't wrong approaches, they were different approaches shaped by different capabilities and constraints. The question wasn't whether American or Australian tactics were better in some absolute sense. The question was what worked effectively in the specific environment of jungle warfare and counterinsurgency. And on that question, Australian experience provided clear answers that many American units were slow to learn. Small units operated more effectively than large ones in dense jungle. Patience achieved better results than speed. Stealth provided more tactical advantage than firepower. Constant patrolling generated better intelligence than large operations. Individual soldier skill mattered more than technological superiority. The equipment differences between Australian and American forces reflected these tactical philosophies. American soldiers typically carried more equipment, supplied by an extensive logistics network that could deliver almost anything to the field. They had access to advanced radio systems, specialized weapons, abundant ammunition, and regular resupply. Australian forces, particularly SAS patrols, carried everything they needed for extended operations and nothing extra. Every item was evaluated for necessity. Weight was minimized because extended patrols in the jungle required soldiers to carry all their supplies on their backs, and excess weight meant fatigue, noise, and reduced mobility. Australian SAS patrols typically carried modified weapons. They preferred the M16 rifle for its lightweight and firepower, but they modified them extensively. Flash suppressors were wrapped or modified to reduce visible signature. They carried M79 grenade launchers for their devastating effectiveness at short range. They used shotguns loaded with buckshot for close-range jungle fighting. They carried claymore mines for defensive positions and ambushes. Every weapon was selected and modified for specific tactical purposes rather than standard issue. Their fieldcraft extended to every detail of equipment. Metal items were wrapped in tape or cloth to prevent noise. Web gear was adjusted and modified to eliminate rattles and squeaks. Canteens were wrapped. Ammunition was carefully packed to prevent metal-on-metal contact. Water purification tablets replaced heavy water supplies. Rations were repackaged to reduce weight and volume. Maps were waterproofed and cut down to show only relevant areas. Compasses were secured where they couldn't swing or make noise. Everything was calculated to reduce weight, eliminate noise, and maximize tactical effectiveness. Personal camouflage was equally meticulous. Australian forces didn't just apply camouflage paint. They studied the specific vegetation and light conditions in their operating areas and adapted their camouflage accordingly. They collected local vegetation and attached it to their uniforms and equipment. They used mud to break up the outline of weapons and equipment. They understood that in the jungle, movement caught the eye more than color, so they moved slowly and stopped often, blending into the background not just visually but behaviorally. American forces generally operated with more standardized equipment, standard-issue weapons, standard camouflage, standard load-bearing equipment. This reflected a logistics system designed for mass armies and standardized training. It worked well for conventional operations where supply lines were secure and standardization enabled rapid replacement and maintenance. But it was less well adapted to the specific requirements of jungle reconnaissance, where every pound of weight and every source of noise mattered. The cultural differences extended to how units prepared for operations. Australian SAS patrols spent days planning and rehearsing before insertion. They studied maps and aerial photographs in exhaustive detail. They memorized terrain features, planned primary and alternate routes, identified rally points and extraction sites, developed contingency plans for various scenarios. They rehearsed movement formations, contact drills, and extraction procedures until every team member could execute them automatically. The planning process itself was a form of training, ensuring that every patrol member understood the mission and could operate independently if the team was separated. American reconnaissance patrols also conducted mission planning, but the level of detail and the time allocated varied significantly. Some units, particularly those that had learned from Australian advisors, adopted similar detailed planning procedures. Others operated on shorter planning cycles, sometimes inserting patrols with less detailed preparation. The difference wasn't negligence or lack of professionalism. It reflected different operational tempos, different command expectations, and different tactical philosophies about the balance between detailed planning and rapid response. The medical preparation also differed. Australian SAS patrols operated with the knowledge that they might not have immediate medical evacuation available. They trained extensively in field medicine, far beyond basic first aid. They carried medical supplies sufficient to treat serious wounds and keep casualties stable for extended periods. They practiced casualty evacuation procedures in jungle terrain, knowing that carrying a wounded man through dense vegetation was extraordinarily difficult. They understood that in long-range reconnaissance operations, self-sufficiency included medical self-sufficiency. American forces had access to excellent medical evacuation by helicopter, often able to extract wounded soldiers within minutes of injury. This was a tremendous advantage, saving lives that would have been lost in earlier conflicts. But it also meant that individual medical training and field medicine skills received less emphasis than in forces that couldn't rely on rapid evacuation. The difference wasn't about caring for casualties. Both forces were committed to that. It was about operational assumptions and the capabilities those assumptions produced. The psychological dimension of jungle warfare was another area where Australian experience provided valuable lessons. Operating in dense jungle, often unable to see more than a few meters in any direction, created a particular kind of stress. Sounds took on outsized importance. The snap of a twig could be an enemy soldier or an animal. Shadows moved in ways that seemed human, but might be vegetation swaying in the wind. The mind played tricks after days of intense alertness. Australian training prepared soldiers for the psychological challenges. Australian patrols developed techniques for maintaining alertness without burning out. They rotated responsibilities within the patrol so that the point man, who bore the greatest stress, could rotate back after a period. They took regular security halts where the entire patrol stopped and simply listened, allowing their senses to adjust to the environment. They learned to trust their instincts while also verifying them before acting. They understood that in the jungle the soldier who could maintain calm, focused alertness for days at a time had a significant advantage over the soldier who was either too cautious or too aggressive. They also understood the importance of physical conditioning specifically for jungle operations. Jungle patrolling required different fitness than other types of warfare. It wasn't about running speed or lifting strength. It was about the ability to carry heavy loads through difficult terrain for extended periods, day after day. It was about maintaining balance on slippery surfaces, pushing through dense vegetation without making noise, moving up steep slopes while controlling breathing, operating effectively in heat and humidity that sapped energy and caused rapid dehydration. Australian training at Canungra specifically built this type of fitness. Soldiers carried full loads on extended patrols through terrain similar to what they'd encounter in Vietnam. They learned to manage hydration, to pace themselves for endurance rather than speed, to recognize and respond to signs of heat exhaustion and heat stroke. They developed the specific muscle strength and stamina needed for jungle operations. American training built general fitness, which was valuable but not as specifically adapted to the demands of extended jungle patrolling. The navigation skills required for jungle operations were also specialized. In open terrain, navigation relied heavily on visible landmarks, compass bearings, and map reading. In the jungle, visibility was often limited to a few meters. Landmarks might not be visible from ground level. Moving in a straight line was often impossible, requiring constant deviation around vegetation, water, and terrain. Australian forces developed navigation skills specifically for these conditions. They learned to navigate by terrain features that might not be visible on maps, subtle changes in vegetation that indicated water drainage, slight variations in slope, distinctive tree species that grew in particular soil conditions. They developed a feel for terrain that went beyond map reading. They could estimate their position by the character of the jungle around them, by the effort required to move through it, by accumulated small observations that built into accurate location awareness. This wasn't mystical or supernatural. It was skill developed through extensive experience and training. They also learned to use pace counting adapted for jungle terrain, where 100 meters might require 15 minutes of movement and numerous direction changes. They learned to memorize terrain features from aerial photographs and recognize them from ground level, where perspective was completely different. They learned to establish position by triangulation from barely visible terrain features, by backtracking to known points, by subtle signs that indicated their location. These were skills that couldn't be taught in a classroom. They required practice, experience, and usually some mistakes. Before mastery was achieved, American forces had access to better maps in some areas, to aerial reconnaissance, and eventually to early forms of electronic navigation aids. But in dense jungle, these advantages were often less useful than the fieldcraft skills that Australian forces had developed. A good map didn't help if you couldn't identify your position on it. Aerial reconnaissance didn't reveal what was under the jungle canopy. Electronic aids had limited utility in an environment where line of sight extended only meters. The Australian approach of building individual navigation skills and terrain sense remained more reliable in jungle conditions. The intelligence-gathering methods also reflected different approaches. American forces had extensive technical intelligence capabilities, signals intelligence, aerial reconnaissance, sensor systems that could detect enemy movement. Australian forces relied more heavily on human intelligence, what patrols observed, what local populations reported, what could be learned from careful analysis of enemy patterns. Both approaches were valuable, but they produced different types of information. Australian SAS patrols spent days or even weeks observing enemy positions and movements. They'd establish observation posts overlooking trails, base areas, or supply routes, and simply watch, recording times, numbers, directions, equipment, anything that might be intelligence value. This patient observation produced detailed, accurate intelligence about enemy capabilities and patterns. It took time, but the intelligence it generated was extremely reliable because it came from direct observation rather than inference or technical analysis. American reconnaissance patrols also conducted observation, but often with shorter timelines. The operational tempo, the demand for rapid results, and the ability to use technical intelligence to fill gaps meant that patrols didn't always have the time for extended observation. They gathered valuable intelligence, but sometimes it was less detailed than what extended observation might have produced. Again, this wasn't a matter of one approach being right and another wrong. It was a matter of different operational contexts producing different methodologies. The relationship between reconnaissance units and supported commanders illustrated another difference. Australian SAS patrols maintained operational independence in how they executed missions. They received taskings and objectives, but patrol commanders had significant authority in how they accomplished those objectives. This trust in small unit leaders was fundamental to Australian military culture. It recognized that the patrol commander on the ground had information and situational awareness that higher headquarters couldn't possess. American reconnaissance operated within a more centralized command structure, with more frequent reporting requirements and less independent decision-making authority at the patrol level. This difference reflected broader command philosophies. Australian forces emphasized what they called mission command, giving subordinates clear objectives and the authority to accomplish them using their judgment. American forces emphasized more detailed control, with specific taskings and more frequent reporting. Both systems could work effectively, but they produced different patterns of operations. Australian patrols might go days without communication if they hadn't observed anything significant. American patrols typically had scheduled communication windows regardless of whether they had information to report. The cultural aspects of learning from allies also shaped how American forces absorbed Australian lessons. Some American units and commanders embraced Australian methods enthusiastically, recognizing their effectiveness and working hard to incorporate them. Others were more resistant, seeing them as too slow, too cautious, or too different from American doctrine. The personal relationships between Australian and American personnel at Recondo School and in combined operations helped overcome some of this resistance. When American soldiers worked directly with Australians and saw their methods in action, most became believers. But personal experience didn't always translate into institutional change. A soldier who learned Australian tactics at Recondo School might return to a unit that didn't support those methods. A commander who understood their value might rotate home and be replaced by someone who didn't. The American system of individual rather than unit rotation meant that expertise was constantly being lost and having to be relearned. Australian forces rotated squadrons and units, maintaining institutional knowledge, and allowing expertise to be preserved and built upon. The challenge of knowledge transfer between allies with different military cultures was inherent in the situation. Australian forces had developed their expertise over decades of continuous operations in Malaya, Borneo, and Vietnam. They had institutional memory, shared experiences, and a culture that valued the specific skills required for jungle warfare. American forces were building expertise rapidly in a conflict environment, with personnel rotating through on one-year tours, with units activated and deactivated, with less institutional continuity. Some knowledge was successfully transferred. Much was learned and then lost when experienced personnel rotated home. The long-term impact of Australian influence on American Special Operations doctrine was nevertheless significant. The Rangers, reactivated during the Vietnam War, incorporated many lessons learned from Australian advisors. The Special Forces, who worked closely with Australians throughout the war, absorbed their tactics and techniques into their own operational methodology. The reconnaissance units that survived the war's end carried forward knowledge that had been shaped by Australian teaching. When American Special Operations underwent renaissance in the 1980s and 90s, much of their doctrine reflected lessons learned in Vietnam, including those learned from Australian allies. These lessons seem obvious in retrospect, but they ran counter to American military culture and doctrine. They required American forces to set aside advantages they possessed and rely on capabilities they hadn't fully developed. They required patience in a political environment that demanded rapid results. They required tactical discipline in situations where aggressive action seemed more natural. They required trust in small unit leaders in a military culture that emphasized centralized control. The Australian ability to demonstrate that these approaches worked was valuable, but implementing them required changes that some American units never fully made. The story of why U.S. forces looked to Australian SAS for tactics they couldn't master isn't just about tactics. It's about the challenge of adapting military doctrine developed for one type of warfare to a completely different environment. It's about the difficulty of learning from others when your own doctrine and culture suggest different approaches. It's about the value of experience and the time required to develop expertise. It's about understanding that success in warfare isn't always about having the most advanced technology or the greatest firepower. Sometimes it's about having the patience to move slowly, the discipline to stay silent, and the wisdom to learn from those who've walked the path before you. The Australian SAS and other Australian forces in Vietnam didn't have technological superiority. They didn't have overwhelming numbers. They didn't have unlimited resources. What they had was knowledge earned through decades of jungle warfare, tactical discipline developed through rigorous training and selection, and an approach to operations that was specifically designed for the environment they were fighting in. They proved that in jungle warfare, those advantages mattered more than technology or firepower. And when American forces finally recognized that truth and sought to learn from Australian expertise, the students found that their teachers had lessons worth learning. The legacy of that knowledge transfer continues today. American Special Operations Forces still emphasize many of the same principles that Australian instructors taught at Recondo School and demonstrated in operations throughout Vietnam. Small team operations, careful planning and rehearsal, emphasis on stealth and fieldcraft, tactical patience, detailed area knowledge through constant patrolling. These remain central to how American Special Operations Forces operate. They were hard lessons, learned over years of trial and error, taught by allies who'd already paid the price to acquire them. And they remain relevant because the fundamental truths of jungle warfare haven't changed, even as technology and tactics have evolved. In the end, the story reveals something essential about military effectiveness. The most powerful military on Earth couldn't simply impose its will through superior resources. It had to learn, to adapt, to study, and to incorporate knowledge from allies who'd mastered skills it lacked. That willingness to learn, even when it required admitting limitations and adopting unfamiliar methods, was itself a kind of tactical mastery. The units and leaders who recognized Australian expertise and sought to learn from it became more effective. Those who didn't often continued to struggle with an enemy who understood the jungle better than they did. When Dean Rusk admitted in 1962 that American forces knew little about jungle warfare, he was acknowledging a problem that would take years to address. Australian forces provided part of the solution, teaching tactics and techniques that worked in an environment where conventional approaches failed. The students didn't master everything their teachers knew. They couldn't fully replicate decades of experience in a few years of war. But they learned enough to transform their reconnaissance and special operations capabilities, enough to understand that jungle warfare required a fundamentally different approach than they'd brought to Vietnam. And that learning, painful and incomplete as it was, represented one of the most significant tactical evolutions of the entire war.